it not showing up? Can you guys see me by any chance? I'm just trying to figure out what's going on. Aha! So I am live. Cool. Okay, I have no idea what the delay on the stream is like, so hopefully it's not too bad. But we'll get started. So, welcome everyone. All right, so I'm gonna break down the digital art conference titles I did. I'm gonna play them first so everybody gets an idea of what I'm doing and we're all sort of on the same page. And from there, I'm just gonna run through a couple of things. I'm gonna try and keep my eye on the questions and things passing by. And if I can't answer them while I'm explaining stuff, I will, and otherwise I'll try and keep some of them until after the stream. So yeah, let's get started. I'm just gonna play these first. I'm gonna hide myself real quick and start this from the beginning. There, and let's see, do I have audio? I think so. Okay, there we go. Sorry about the loop there. So yeah, now that everybody's seen that, that's basically the project I'm going to break down, and I'm going to start at the beginning, and that way you can sort of follow along with the project a little bit, and I can talk a little bit about my workflow. So let's have a look here. So basically when this project started, I sat down with Daniel, the guy that is organizing the event, and asked him for some sort of briefing, and he basically said, well, the logo is a triangle, and that's it. And I sort of went from there. So pretty interesting. Usually when I work with clients, I have a very clear briefing, and on this one I sort of got to do whatever I wanted. And to me, that was basically like, hey, you know, all you need, just put in triangle. So I was like, okay, cool. I'll see what we can do with that. So I started out with some stuff, just testing some stuff in the very beginning. And let's see, I think, do I have one here? Yeah, so I had a test shot here, which is very simple. Let's see if I can blow this up a little bit. So first I had the idea of sort of a wireframe and a bunch of scanned 3D stuff that would have the wireframe sort of pull away as this logo spun around and sort of looked cool. But and hello to everybody, by the way, that's joining. And then I actually ended up rendering a very quick test render of that as well. And it was interesting, but I didn't really feel like I could do something cool with it. I wanted to do something a little bit more interesting and I guess a little bit more out there. So I decided to abandon that. And that's generally what I'll do, especially when I start, is I'll just try stuff and just like try one idea after the next and mess around with it. And unfortunately, I threw quite a bit of that stuff away. But one of the other things I tried when I was getting into There we go. Like triangles and stuff. If I had this like field of triangles, see if I could do anything with these, if I could animate them. And I like the idea, but it just wasn't really there. So like I said, in the beginning, it's all about sort of finding the concept, and I'm not a concept artist and I can't really draw very well. So I do stuff in 3D very quickly and see if any of the ideas stick or if I see anything that I like. So the next one that I tried after that was this pyramid. And then let's see, I think if I play this, you can see it's sort of opening up and there was something inside. And this is where the first sort of stage of the idea came from. I ended up not using that inside thing because it's, I don't know, I didn't really like it or whatever. But I like the idea of having a triangle pyramid that was basically created out of triangles. And that way sort of taking that triangle concept and maybe even as a joke, just pushing it as far as it could possibly go. So this is just very basic. Let's see if I can show you something here. So the way this was set up, it was just a very simple cone that I brought down to the least amount of, what do you call it, least amount of iterations and things, and then I just subdivided it a few times. Then it was a case of displacing it a little bit, smoothing it out, and solidifying it, and then trying stuff. I don't know if the displace was actually on in the beginning, but that's generally how I do a lot of stuff. Just try things with modifiers really quickly. I don't use animation nodes actually. I've been trying to get into it and it's interesting, but I do a lot of my stuff with modifiers, and you'll see that in some of the other files that I'll open. So with this in mind, I started messing around, and I generally do like style frames and stuff. So I don't know, this is when the first thing sort of hit me. So you can see this is pretty close to what it ended up looking like. And the thing is, you see the lines behind the particles, they're actually an artifact. It was just the motion blur freaking out because it didn't know what to do with the caches. And I sort of got my idea here. I also had like an inside there and some lights. So the idea at some point sort of, I figured out what I wanted to do. So I set off to make this, but make it look more interesting, because like I said, these lines, they aren't correct. They're just render artifacts. And I have that a lot when I'm working. Just these happy accidents, and then trying to find a way to figure out like, how can I push this and how can I make this into something more interesting. So I'll start with the first shot here really quick. There we go. And here you can see, and I think, yeah, a lot of these are 2 screens, because generally when I'm working, I'll have a second screen with everything open. So here you see the final result. And as you can see, the scenes get fairly slow, and I'll break down how I did this, this effect with these things growing in just a little bit, but I'll do it in a separate scene so it's not quite as slow. But basically, I have a bunch of elements here. Let me think, because I've got to figure out what's what. So I have, let's see, yeah, so I have the particles themselves, and that's really just an object with a particle instance modifier, as far as I can tell. Is it there? Or is it just the particles themselves? It looks like they're just straight up particles. Yeah. So I have this frame around everything that's emitting light, and that's emitting the particles. And I just have some forces, some turbulence forces and things, messing with them. I'm not going to go too much into detail because I've got a lot of stuff that I want to cover, so I'm going to go fairly quick. But just to give you an idea of how I did those curves, they look fairly interesting. And let's see if we can render them real quick. This might take a while. There you go. So to get those curves, basically what they are, if I were to turn this off, and it's going to get really slow, they're just curves. So they're regular curves in Blender, but I didn't draw them or anything. I got them from a particle simulation. So I'll just open up a new file really quick to show you that. Where are we? So I'm going to open a plane and just do a very quick particle sim. I'm going to turn off gravity really quickly, and then add in a force field, put in turbulence. I will upload the VOD after the stream. It will be archived and everybody will be able to access it. I'm recording it as well just in case it doesn't work. So I have a backup, and I've definitely got every intention of uploading this, and people can watch it whenever they want afterwards. So here I have a turbulence field, and I'm going to add in my particles. So let's see what we get. So they move around a little bit. Nothing too interesting. So let's see if we can get that to work in our favor. Where's my dynamics here? So if you turn up this flow parameter, you get these really interesting looking animations. And the reason for that is it's using that force and changing it into like air velocity type of things, and the particles will keep following that path. So you can see them breaking up, and I'm just going to change the length here. There we go. And I think I'm going to have to make the turbulence field a little bit larger. So let's try something like that. There we go. You can see how those move in sort of an interesting way. And now that I have all these particles, usually what I'll do is I'll bake them. Where are we? Cache. Just bake them. You don't need to bake them to disk or anything. And then the cool thing is, once you go down to here, you can set this to path, and you're going to get these particle paths. Now, this might look a little bit weird, but the trick is in the display setting down here. If you up these steps, then I think you can start seeing what I did there with the other stuff. So now these are just particle paths, but it's really cool if you just hit convert on your particle system over here, and I can turn off the plane. Now this is just a mesh, and then if you hit Alt-C on your keyboard, you could actually create these into curves, and now this is a curve object. So you can animate them. It's going to set this to full and set the bevel resolution, and now you can actually see those curves pop up, and you can animate them from start to finish. So basically I animated them, let's say we'll start at 0 and 0. Oh, actually maybe move to the beginning of my timeline real quick. So animate it, set this to 1 and 1, animate those. And now nothing's going to happen because obviously they're at the same value. So what I'm going to do is go back to about 200 frames maybe, and set this one to 1 so it comes in a little bit earlier. And this is just a very quick way of doing so. And now you get these really interesting looking curves. So then when you want to shade them, I'm not going to go over that because it's fairly simple. You can just use a gradient texture in your node editor. Or actually, I'll try and do it really quick. Why not? So put a new material on them, and I set this to render. It's going to get really warm in here. I'm going to try and do this quickly. So we've got a texture, gradient texture, and then I always use the Node Wrangler add-on for the quick things. And then it's a case of looking at the UVs. So where are we? If you open up texture space here and you put in use UV for mapping, you can plug in the UV here, and basically it'll map that gradient over that shape. So when these move around, yeah, unfortunately you can't see it. Let's see if I can preview it a little bit better. This higher up. Now you can actually see that gradient follows the curve. So you can do some really cool things. So you can mix in an emission shader with a transparent shader, and basically you've got that effect. And that's it for that one. It's fairly straightforward, but it's just like all these little tricks that you got to figure out and then bring together. And then you get these really interesting looking things. So that's that for that one. And I've got a little cheat sheet here of the stuff that I want to do. So, oh yeah, another thing that might be interesting to some people is the look. So let me grab the render here really quick. Actually, I'll do shot 2 because it's going to be a little bit better. And oh no, that's for the next one. Sorry. So yeah, so basically just regular particles, and I use the same particle system for the curves to create them as I did with the regular particles. And a lot of the other stuff is just compositing. And then this thing opening up is what you saw earlier. It's just a subdivided pyramid, I guess, and it just opens up. So if you edge split something and you put a smooth modifier on it and you animate that smooth modifier up, basically what's going to happen is, and I'll show this with a cube, it's very, very simple, but you can see it immediately. So let's say I have a cube and I subdivide it 2 times maybe, just very quickly, and then I edge split it. So Control E for the edge menu. Now what happens when you do that is these all suddenly become loose parts, even though it's one object. But the cool part is if you throw a smooth modifier on here, not a surface deform, but a smooth, then you can animate either the factor or the repeat, depending on how you prefer to animate it. And all these will actually become smaller. So that's how you can open up the I guess the triangle pyramid thing the way I did. And then it's just a case to give it thickness of adding in a solidify modifier and then just pushing it out, and then there you go. And you can see you can do some really fun stuff with this. I like playing around with these, and that's why I do a lot of stuff with modifiers rather than animation nodes, because I find this to be a little bit quicker. I'm sure once I get the hang of animation nodes, I'll get better at it. So somebody asked, what's better, Maya, Blender, 3ds Max? You know what, whatever you're comfortable using. I've used Blender, 3ds Max, and Cinema 4D, and honestly, it's whatever you prefer. I prefer Blender, I just like the way it works. But any of the applications that you want to use, you know, just go for it. If you're doing motion graphics and this type of thing, I'd say Cinema 4D is probably one of the best ones, if not the best one at the moment, because it has a lot of MoGraph tools, but you can do a lot of cool stuff in Blender. And Maya has Mesh now, which is a motion graphics system as well, which is pretty powerful, even though I've only seen stuff coming from it, but it looks really, really nice and really fun to use. So, okay, let's see, what's the next part of what I wanted to do? Oh yeah, so let's open the next shot here, and let's see, shot number 3, somewhere further down. So that one was interesting, but it's still the same technique. So a lot of it is just pushing the camera around and trying stuff. And I'll show you a little bit of, I guess, sort of how it progressed through the project and how I approach this kind of stuff. So the next one I want to show you is how I created this sort of displaced golden pyramid. It's a very simple sort of basic gold shader, but the displacement was created with this really cool little application. And yeah, I don't know, I'm trying to figure out which shot shows it best, maybe towards the very end of this one. There we go. So see how this is displaced. So this is a little application. It's called JS placement. If you've never used it before, it's free. It's really cool. And basically, all it does is it creates these really crazy maps. So if you click on here, these are really good displacement maps. So if you want that really like MoGraph techie looking stuff, JS placement is awesome for it. Now, the best part is that you can create custom sprites. So I think, here we go. If you put in custom sprites, and I'll have to have a look here. So what I did is I created all these SVGs. They're basically triangles in 10 different shades of gray and, let's see, there you go, in all directions. So they're just triangles in all directions. And they then, in turn, once I put these in the custom sprites folder for JS placement, what it can do is it can grab those and it can use those. So I don't know where it is. Is it classic? One of them accepts the custom sprites, I believe. Yeah, so if you put in custom sprites here, if I were to copy those over, let's see, no, backup, applications, not applications, placement, custom sprites. So if I were to copy these into my home folder, there we go. Where are we? Maybe load the application again. I'll close those applications. Yeah, I haven't made a link for this yet, so I have to go to the directory every single time. Can I paste the name in chat? Yes, of course. JS placement. So now if I go to the JS placement 2, I set this to custom sprites, I'm going to get this sort of crazy looking displacement map. And that's really all I did, and that's what ended up giving me that effect. So I used subdivision displacement, which if you want to know how to use that, I would actually point you towards my other tutorial. If you check out my channel, there's a tutorial there on how to use displacement, subdivision displacement. And I just follow that and use the map that you get. So I think it creates like a 4K map. It's really, really big. So you can do whatever you want with it and do some cool stuff. So just to show you, I believe, let's see if I go to shot 1 or shot 3, 4, where are my textures? No, it's in there somewhere, but basically that's all I did. So I'm not gonna, I'm not gonna go through it. You guys are meeting up. That's awesome. Let's have a look, see what else did I want to talk about. Tests, I've talked about that. I've talked about the placement. What was next? Okay, so the compositing. So I'll break down the compositing for one of the shots. You have to let it render first. So let's see, I'm going to do shot 2 because that is definitely the one where you can see the effect the best. So unfortunately, I'm going to have to let this render. And as you can see, it's a pretty big compositing stack, but I'm going to turn off all the different things so you can see exactly what's going on and yeah, sort of what all the elements were and how I did them. So, all right, let's see. It's in the 3D view and hit up the camera, and how fast is this going to render? I'm just going to turn down the samples a little bit so it renders a little bit quicker. It'll be slightly noisier, but it's not the end of the world. It can still show exactly what's going on. So yeah, looking at a rendered screen. Come on. Give it a sec. Come on. Okay, there we go. So I hope it's not too slow, but yeah, we'll be able to see it. So here you also see the difference between sort of the end result and the raw render. I definitely did quite a lot of compositing on these. Blender's compositor is very capable once you start figuring out how it works. I know a lot of people try it out and they use like 3 basic things and that's it. And I use a whole bunch of stuff. So I use some denoising in this one as well. And then as you can see now, it's going to pop up, and that's sort of the end result. So somebody was asking me before on Twitter if I put this stuff in after, but I generally do it all in Blender because I really like it. So and that way I can render it out, get a final version, and then go into editing, which I'll talk about a little bit. So let me open this up real quick and go to the image editor, and hopefully this will be somewhat visible. I'll try to zoom in and out. Generally, when I'm doing this type of thing, I have more than one screen, so I will have this up on a second screen and have it full screen so I can look at it in full resolution, and then that way I can see exactly what's going on. So I had some render passes here that I didn't end up using, so I'm just going to throw those out, actually, as not to confuse everybody. And then I'm going to turn off all these mix nodes, and then we'll start at the beginning and I'll show you how I mix stuff in and how it works basically. So mute all of those. There we go. So one of the first things I tend to do is add this glare shader in because you know, if you don't have a glow, then you should definitely look into that. That's the reason why things actually, when you're rendering things and making them, compositing them in post-production, and you want stuff to look as if it's emitting light, you need it to glow. That's the only way to give it sort of that convincing look. So I mean, if I turn this off, you can see immediately, doesn't matter what color this is, nobody's like really able to see that this is glowing and you know, emitting light. So the moment you turn off or turn on the glare again, you'll see, bang, there it is. The glow works really well. So then the next thing, I'm just going to turn them on one by one and have a look. So yeah, what I tend to do a lot is add in sort of this fake lighting afterwards. It's a very simple trick, but it really helps to sell the effect. So if I turn on the second one here as well, you'll see all of a sudden, even though this is blank space, all this negative space becomes more interesting because there's something going on there, and it gives you this hint that there's lighting coming from both sides, and it just fakes it a little bit. And you don't, if you're going to render this stuff with volumetrics, especially if you're doing like animations, it's going to take a really long time. So if you can fake it, it's really, really handy. So what I'm going to do now is just pipe that in really quickly so you can see exactly what I'm doing. There we go. So that's all it is. I'm going to turn off all the different nodes. So I basically start off with this ellipse mask. It's a very simple tool in the compositor. All it is, it's going to draw a white circle on a black background, which is really cool. So the next part is I just colorize it using a color ramp. Nothing special, I just turn it blue. There's a million different ways to do this. I just like using a color ramp. And then the next thing I do is add in a blur. So that will blur it out. It will give me this really nice gradient that I can overlay on top of the image. So let's pipe this back in. Oh. There we go. And turn this one off really quickly. So then once I put that in, it's just a case of setting it to add. So I always use very simple transforms, color transforms like add, multiply, and things like that, because they're a lot easier to manage. And especially if you're working with stuff like Filmic Blender, you want to make sure that you keep everything simple and you're not getting crazy colors and weird things that doing all kinds of math. Open my camera setting. Yeah, I'll talk about that in just a second. Actually, I can talk about that really quickly right now. So my camera is basically, whenever you create a camera in Blender, it's always a 35mm camera, and a 35mm camera is quite wide, as they say, and it's something that I see a lot in people's work, is that they don't think about the cinematography. And I look up a lot of stuff about cinematography. I love watching movies, and I've got quite an interest in photography and cinematography in general, and it's really important that you start learning all the different types of lenses, because if you're going to just use a 35mm standard lens in Blender for everything, then it's just going to start looking really weird and samey. And generally I use a lot of lenses that are like 70mm, 85mm, because you can really focus in on something and it gives you a more compressed look, which gives you a bit of a cooler sort of feel. So I'll show you really quickly what the difference would be. So if we have the 70mm here, and then I'll get back to the compositing. Here we go. Give it a sec to calculate out. Come on, there we go. So this 70mm is giving me a really flat look. If I go back to the 35, which is standard in Blender, and I just move my camera in a little bit, what you'll see is that, and peak the distance here. There we go. What you'll see is everything sort of becomes a little bit distorted and pointing out. Now this might not be the very best scene to show it, but generally the way I try to explain it is, if you've ever seen a Beastie Boys music video, you know what a fisheye lens is, where they're like close to the thing, close to the camera, and like it's all distorted and they get close. So the further you go down, let's say I use a 12mm, the more sort of exaggerated the look is going to be. So now you can see what's going on. If I just change the distance again, I'm actually going to turn this down to 0 for a sec. Now you can see everything gets really, really close, and it just like gets super weird and super distorted. So that's generally why I'll use something like a 70mm, because if you go back now and look at that same image, all of a sudden you get this really cool static, nice framed thing that works a lot better. So to pick the distance, by the way, is if you hover over the distance and you hit the E key on your keyboard, E, and then just click anywhere, and that'll bring it into focus. And then the second thing you want to do is add in some depth of field, so that brings your foreground or your background, will blur it out, and you'll get a nice focal point. So the reason I use this stuff is you make stuff look really cool immediately. And for example, if I click on the point here, then the point is going to be in focus and everything else is going to be out of focus. When would I use a wide lens? Let's say if you're, it really depends on the project, honestly. I found that I use more, like less wide lenses and more sort of telephoto lenses in 3D. It depends on your scene. I'm trying to think if there's a good reason why to use a wide lens. Oh yeah, if you're doing architectural stuff, for example, and you need to show an entire thing, I don't know if I can show that yet, but I did a project recently where I had to show a really big window and there was some stuff in the foreground, and it was just like an architecture render. That's when you want to use a wide lens, because you want to convey the whole scene, you want to see everything. And once you get into something, you really want to focus on something and make it sort of look cool or be really close to it and get a lot of depth of field going, then I'll generally switch over to telephoto. It's just unfortunate because even if you look at like the standard 3D view here, I even set that to a telephoto lens. So this view over here is normally set to 35. So this is what Blender's view looks like, and you can see the grid is already getting really distorted. So I generally set this to 70, and now you get almost, it's not an isometric view, but you get sort of a nice, yeah, I think it's a nicer viewport. To me, it just makes more sense. I think it's because I came from 3ds Max and the camera used to be a little bit closer in than in Blender. And you can see it really clearly here. If I would set this to like 24, you see how distorted everything gets. And for something like this, it's really hard to frame this in a nice way because all these lines are getting pushed around and they look really weird. While if I would set this to, say, an 85mm, then it's a lot more zoomed in, but you can see it looks a lot more static. The shapes become a lot more rigid and a lot more interesting to look at. So it's definitely something that you should play around with when you're messing with your camera. It's really, really important, and it's something that a lot of 3D artists tend to overlook. They just grab a camera, they put it in there, and bang, they don't think about anything else. And it's really important that you do. So yeah. So let's see. I see a lot of names in here that I know. That's awesome. All right, so let's get back to the compositing. So the bottom one, as I explained before, it's just that ellipse mask and then a color ramp and a blur just to get that blurry effect. It's the same as a gradient ramp in something like After Effects. Now, what I tend to do as well is I animate them. So maybe just having them coming in a little bit, you can see how these are going to switch places. This one lights up a little bit more, moves over here. This one moves over here. It's very, very subtle, but it's all these little things that come together that give it a feeling of movement. So what I try to do is whenever I'm moving the camera, have a lot of my post-production effects, try to move with it a little bit or do something with it, so it's not just completely static. Then the next part is just a curves adjustment. So I just use this to yeah, mess with the colors a little bit. So this was looking a little bit too green. So first, usually I'll add in a little bit of contrast, but it really depends. And then I brought in a little bit of red and a little bit of blue to sort of counteract the green because I wanted a more, I just felt like it was a better look. And that's generally how I do things. Just push and pull all these different channels to see what happens. Like for example, if you push the green channel, just look at what happens. The compositor is a little slow, unfortunately, but yeah, curves is really cool because I take away the green and all of a sudden I'm left with this really crazy image, and maybe that's something you didn't think of originally, but you can move on and sort of push forward. So let's see, the next thing I add, this one gets a little bit interesting, I think. So let's have a look. Is that just a glow? It looks like it. Okay, so this is another little trick I use, which I'll try to break down for you really quickly. So I grab my regular image, I just start from the image, and all these little nodes that you see, they're called, let's see, where are they? They're called reroute nodes, and you can put them in, and then basically you can move that line around, and I just use them to clean it up a little bit. But what's really cool is that if you use the, It's called the Node Wrangler add-on, and you hold down Shift and drag, it creates one for you. So you can really quickly organize your nodes. But all this is, and I'm just going to plug it in here just to show you, is, there we go, it's just the raw image. Now the next thing I do is I grab this threshold. So this filter is called, if you go into filter, it's called dilate erode. There you go. And you can set it to threshold mode. And basically what it's going to do is it's going to grab all your highlights and make a black and white mask out of them. So then I'll just try and grab only the elements that I want, and then just blur it out ever so slightly so I don't get a razor sharp mask, because sometimes I can flicker a little bit. Just very basic. And then if I put in a color, where are we? Mix node. So we've got this mix node over here. And I set it to multiply. I basically multiply back in my original image, as you can see. So this node is both going to the input here and to the second input over here. So it's both driving the dilate, and all this does is, because this is a black and white mask, it puts in the color again. So in After Effects or Nuke, you could do the same thing, because somebody's asking if you can do this in After Effects or Nuke as well. In After Effects, I believe it's called the threshold filter. It's an effect that you can find that you could use. You could do the same thing basically, and then either use a LumaMat or yeah, just multiply them together, whatever you prefer. And then in Nuke, I'm sure there's a node somewhere that does it, which is called similar. Always try looking for threshold or something like that. And yeah, so basically now I've colorized this, and then all I do after that is set the glare to give these really interesting things. So I chose to go for 3 iterations. You can do 4 or 5 or whatever. Or no, sorry, not streaks, not iterations. And that just gives you more of a star-like feel. The reason I went with 3 is because we're doing triangles and I want to do everything 3, 3, 3, 3, 3. And most people don't see that, but you know, you gotta have a little bit of fun with this stuff and enjoy yourself. Now, the most important things about this glare is when you set it to streaks, the cool thing is you have this little color modulation slider, and normally this is set to like 2.5 or something like that. You get these regular looking streaks, but the higher you push it, the more these break up and you get these really weird looking things. And I'm a big fan of really streaky, weird things. Now, if you set this normal, this mix to 0, it's gonna just put it on top of the original image. And if you set the mix to mix to -1, it's just gonna show you the original image. But if you set it to 1, it's just gonna show you the streaks themselves. So that allows me to go in here and then add these on top. Again, I'm using just add, because if you want to put more light in the image or make it feel brighter, you're always just going to add in, and it's always going to make sure that you don't get too much artifacts and things like that as well. And this is a case of adding them in, pushing them further if I really want to. There we go, and you can just mess around with this. So I've messed with the settings now, but it's okay. We can keep on going here. Let's see what else. I'm just going to move this over. So then, by the time I got here, I was like, okay, this is looking interesting, but there's not enough there yet. I want a little bit more. So this is where we get into the really fun stuff, I think, if I'm correct. Wow, this isn't adding anything? That'd be hilarious. What's going on here? Oh, of course, because my final node isn't plugged in. There we go. Let's see. So this side stuff is really, really fun to do. So I'm again just gonna unplug the effect here, or plug it into my viewer so you can see the final thing. So this is what I'm actually getting out. So again, to do this, this node was just the image itself. So I split it up and I use that image over and over and over again. So the first thing I'm gonna do is I translate it. So the translate node allows you to wrap around the image. So because this thing is in the middle, I knew I wanted sort of like these side streaks that moved along. So if you want all this stuff to be responsive to your render, then you can always just use the original image to do things. And you'll see in just a sec, once I point it out, you won't be able to unsee it. You actually see an echo of the image the whole time. And it looks really cool. If you don't know what it is, you don't notice it. But once you know it, yeah, that's basically it. So what do I do here? I split that image up. The first one is just a blur. I set it to fast Gaussian, and I always turn on this little relative switch because it's relative to the size of your canvas. So 35% will stretch it like 35% of your canvas or something like that. I'm just used to using it this way. If you turn it off, you could just do it like this if you really wanted to. But the most important part is that you don't, even if you get these really streaky things, if I set this to 0, you're gonna see you get these lines, and I don't really like that. I like to blur them out in the y-axis a little bit as well. So you get, yeah, you get nice sort of softer blurs and things like that. And then the second one, let me have a look here. It's just a blurred version of it. So I just blurred it out a little bit. And then I brought these two together. Let me make sure that I get it here. There we go. And this is basically the image that I'm overlaying. But what I'm doing is, once I've overlaid it, all I'm going to do is just bring the factor down to like 0.002. So if I set this to 1, then it's going to get like crazy overblown, and you know, you're not really going to be able to look at it. But just by using a really, really low value, all of a sudden I filled up all this negative space with these interesting looking things. Then the next thing I'm going to do, let's see, I think it's just adding a bit of a vignette. Maybe over here, there we go. So I'm going to turn that on, and yeah, just darken those down a little bit. So this is a trick I'm sure I've shown before somewhere, but again, all it is just that ellipse mask. So I just make a circle, set in the middle with one height 1, and you basically get that ellipse mask. Very simple. Blur it out. There we go. And I tend to blur it quite heavily so it's not completely black, and then multiply it over the image with a color mix node, and basically that's all it does. So vignette, you can do this in pretty much any compositing application. And it's just the reason I do it is just so the effect is still visible, but your focus is still in the middle. Because if this stuff is too bright, people are going to be looking at this and they're not actually going to be looking at your final image. By the way, here you can see what I was saying. So here you actually see the blurred out version of it as well. And yeah, it's just that translated. And this compositing stack, I basically reused over and over in pretty much every shot and just tweaked it a little bit here and there wherever needed it. Maybe turned some things on and off depending on what I needed. Because I have this last step that I do, and I'm just going to set this to 1. And if I unmute this node, you're going to see put a really fairly heavy grain on it. So the reason I like to use grain is because generally it just brings your whole image together. The most important thing about when you're doing CG stuff is that nothing is ever like razor sharp, depending on your image. Obviously, if you're doing ArchViz and they want like a super sharp, mega high res image, great. But if you're doing animation and it looks too sharp, it's going to look fake in CG very quickly. Now, obviously, this stuff, it looks CG because it's almost, you know, you can't really do this in real life, but there's something to making it look like it was shot on a camera. And one of those really important elements is grain. So there's a really quick and easy way to do this in Blender. I use the linear light for this, but you can use screen or whatever looks best depending on your scene. But if you go into your textures node down here and you go into the world textures, what you can do is you can actually create a new texture in here. And if you use the noise pattern in Blender, let me plug it in, for example. The cool thing about it is, I'm just going to skip through every frame. It changes every frame, so it's just like static noise, like on an old television or something like that. And by creating it here in the world texture view, you just give it a name, and then in the compositor, you can actually bring in those textures. So if you go into input, texture, it'll show you all the different textures that you used in the in your Blender file. So these aren't cycles textures, but they are the same ones that you would use in here. So if you go into world, it doesn't matter. But basically you access them through here, just make a new one and then put in the nodes, and then you can bring it into the node editor, which is really nice. So because this changes every frame, and you'll see if I move it here, so I'm just gonna hit right and go to one frame later, and you'll see it update. There we go, it changes. You get this really nice sort of fake film grain you can overlay, which is really cool. and that's it. And that's basically it. So it's all these different little tricks, but as you can see, none of them are super complex. Most of them are fairly simple, but it's all about the layering and trying to figure out cool ways to add detail. And that for me, when I'm doing compositing, is the most important part. Don't try to add too many things in there that aren't like in there, but just try and make whatever you have look really cool, and really push it forward and further forward. So I'm just going to add a switch node very quickly so we can switch between these two really easily. Switch. So there we go, and put in our original here so we can have one last comparison. So that's what we started with. And bring this down and zoom in a little bit. So the switch node just allows you to switch between two different inputs, and then we just boosted it and added into it. So you can see there's a lot that's happening post-production, but the most important part to remember is, like, if your render isn't that great, don't try and fix it in post. Try and fix your 3D first and then try and make it look better afterwards. So that's that. All right, so that was compositing. What's my next thing? Okay, so the next one is one of my favorite shots, and I think a lot of people were fairly interested in me breaking this one down. So I believe it's shot 5. I think it's 5. I'll make sure I open the right one now. No, it's 6 apparently. Is it? Yeah. All right, so this one. So this is a pretty interesting one. I'm gonna start at the beginning. Again, let's have a look. So I don't know how fast this is going to play. All right, so this is the shot where all these little things sort of, the pyramid opens up and all these little things start like sort of disappearing down into it. So it's very basic, but it's all about what's going on here. Okay, so you see the way there's a whole bunch of stuff in here moving around. So when you look at this, let's see if I can figure out, because obviously I didn't name everything properly, and I just need to figure out real quick. All right, so that was set to verts. So this was fairly complex to get it to work. It took me a while to figure this one out, I'll be honest. I just need to make sure I can see. Okay, there we are. So basically the way to set this up, and I'm not going to try and replicate it because it's going to take forever. I'm just going to try and explain how I did it. So I do a lot of stuff with dynamic paint in Blender. So what dynamic paint allows you to do is, let's see, did I set all of these to wire? That would be really annoying. Looks like it. Okay. Set them to, oh, seriously? Okay, so I'll just show you how I did it with one. So this plane, basically, let's have a look. All that's happening is it's got a solidify modifier on it, and then a really gnarly displacement. It looks really weird, but all I'm trying to do is basically, as this moves down, you can see it moves, but what it's doing is it's trying to activate the dynamic paint on this object. So dynamic paint allows you to select vertices when they come in contact with other objects. So I think this one was probably better to show. Let's see, solid, there you go. Actually, I'm gonna set this to wire, and then it might be, draw all the edges, there we go. I was hoping this would be clearer, but apparently it's not. So basically what's happening is I have this one object that is driving the dynamic paint on the other object. So it's just moving down, and whenever it hits it, what's happening with this is the vertexes are being displaced down. So if I turn off the displace, and this might actually be clearer, you can see what's happening. So each one of these planes, if I go look into the dynamic paint, it has, where is it? Yeah, so it has these values in here, which basically, if you set this to color ramp, what happens is you can either use it to change the fall off of the dynamic paint, or in this case, I just set it to a single color, which means I can control the vertex weight of the object that paints. So what's happening is you can see these moving downwards. And this is the first plane, because you can see there's 10 planes. It's the second plane, third plane, fourth plane, fifth plane, and so on. And they just have an increasing weight. So what means, what happens then, if I turn this displace back on, because this displace, all it's doing is it's pushing stuff down in the z-axis. So what's happening is, as all these different weights get applied through the dynamic paint, come on, and yes, it's quite slow, but it works. You can see layer after layer being pushed down, and it looks really interesting. So you get this really weird looking thing, but because I'm doing that and I've got this plane taking care of business, now I've got this effect that's moving down really nicely. And there's probably even a better way to do it with textures and things, but once I turn on the dupliverts, now all of a sudden we have, where are we? There we go. This is a really finely remeshed pyramid. So I have a lot of vertices, and then I use dupliverts, which basically allows you to, let's see if I can, where is this thing? It won't just show me the cylinder. Just the cylinder. It allows me to push this one object. It's just a single object. Let's go back. There we go. It allows me to distribute it over the vertices of that object. And then as it's being pushed down, you'll see they follow those vertices and they get pushed down as well. And you get this really interesting effect where the pyramid sort of looks like it's being eaten away. It's a bit of a pain in the ass to set up, but once you get it working, you can see it looks really cool. And then I just chose a camera point of view because I knew that pyramid was going to open up. Here you can see it's just rigged very, very basically. And I'm going to hide those planes again because they're going to be really messing with us. There we go. And then because I knew this was going to open up, I chose a camera view where I could basically hide everything under the pyramid and not worry about it. And a lot of this type of workflow is exactly that. Like, once you know your camera view and you want to do something cool with it, then you can use that to hide stuff. Like, don't shy away from that. It's not really much of a problem. And as you can see, then it opens up, and as it gets eaten away, you get this really cool effect. And that's basically how I did it. Dynamic paint is super powerful once you get the hang of it. It can do some really amazing things, and I really like working this way because it gives me a lot of flexibility to change things after the fact. And yeah, it works. It looks fine. It's a total hack, but hey, sometimes that's what you got to do. So, and then it finishes, and basically all that's happened is that entire thing is pushed under everything else, and you can just see it disappear. And at the end of the shot, and I'll just move to the end, if I hide this for a sec, you can see that whole thing is just pushed down, and it looks like an absolute mess, but you can't see it through the bottom layer, and the logo's in there then, and that's it. And it's all kind of nicely tucked away under the thing. So it's all about cheating as well. Sometimes you just got to try and get away with stuff by hiding it somewhere, somehow. And yeah, that's basically it. So I'm trying to figure out, I think there's one last thing. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how I finish this then and edit it and add all the text in and everything. So again, if we were to look at this compositing chain, you can see it looks really, really similar to before. And basically all of the shots use a very similar compositing chain. As you can see, if you see this, now you're starting to see, oh yeah, I mirrored it, it's in there. It looks very similar. You see a lot of the same sort of elements, the grain and the glows and everything are very similar. And because I started from one file and just added in, just hit save as for the next shot and reused it whenever I needed to, it's really nice because you can keep this chain, and then just, I changed a little bit of the values here and maybe turn some of this stuff off or turned it down depending on the shot. and you can work really quickly, and you get a very similar looking result that you can tweak very easily and make it look nice towards the end. So yeah, then the next thing, so let's see, I think we're getting towards the end here, but then after I put all those renders, I render them out on this on my network drive. Generally what I'll do, I'll have a second drive in my computer, which is an SSD, which is a lot quicker. And what I'll do is I'll just make like make movies of these shots. So they're the finished shots, and then one by one I'll just go through and make a little movie, because it's a lot quicker to edit with these, and then I'll just put them on the SSD and edit. So let's see. Let's open this up, shall we? And for editing, I use Kdenlive, and there we go. I hope it loads because I changed the version recently. So you can do this in pretty much anything, honestly. It doesn't matter what application you use. I use Kdenlive because it's open source, and I've been using a lot of open source stuff lately. So very easily, I just fade from black, and then all this stuff down here is the audio. There we go. And then I have the music starting here. And all it's about in Kdenlive, and you can do the same thing in something like Premiere or whatever, you can just make titles. And one thing I really like about Kdenlive actually is its title editor. It's, even though it's fairly basic, let's see, let me just show the background real quick, see if we can see something. And of course it's not going to work when I tell it to. Anyway, it doesn't really matter, but the cool thing is it's got a little grid. And why won't you show me the background? It always works except for when I need it to. Let's see. There we go. So something I really like about it is that you have a grid, which I don't know how visible it's going to be. Oh, there we go. Which you can just snap to really easily. And I like that. I like working with a grid. It's just easy. And just put them in. And all of this stuff that you see is basically just to fade them in. So in something like, let's see, Premiere or whatever, these are a lot easier because you can just animate the opacity or an After Effects or something like that. It's a lot quicker. Kdenlive is a little weird when it's talking about its compositing stack. So that's why there's a lot of stuff going on, but it's very simple. Okay, so somebody's asking something. Do I have a final result in my head before I start doing stuff in Blender, or do I often improvise during the project? More of the second part, because when I started out doing 3D stuff, I usually tried to create what was in my head, and then I would get super frustrated that it didn't work because I was, either not good enough yet, or the thing I wanted to do was like really complex. And after a while, I started feeling that limited me in a little bit, because I would just get angry at myself and be like, oh, you suck, why can't you do this? Why can't you do this? And after a while, the moment I started letting that go and sort of letting the art create itself, and that sounds maybe a little bit weird, but things got a lot easier. So I would say when you're first starting, you can try and make some stuff, but don't get too bogged down in the details of it. Just try things and try a lot of things. And after a while, you start like feeling the things that you really like doing and you think are really interesting. But the main thing is, with a project like this, it's sort of a blessing and a curse, because the brief was like, oh, the logo's a triangle, go nuts. And while that's really fun on the one hand, it's also a bit stressful, because you're like, okay, I want to make sure that's something cool, that we can make it look good. But it turned out to be really fun. And I tend to iterate a lot. So in the beginning, I showed you a couple of things that I tried. And that's what I do. I just go in there and try stuff and see what sticks. And I'll try things, and sometimes I'll render something and I won't. And you'll see, I'll show you some of the shots when I'm editing, that a lot of some of the shots that I tried in the beginning, yeah, they didn't quite work out. So the moment I rendered this, the moment I got here to like this shot, when I was doing this stuff, when I figured this one out, I was like, okay, I found the look. I know I've got to build on this and do something cool. And then I just tried to figure out the story as I went along. Depending on your clients, some clients will give you a brief with what you need to do exactly, and then obviously it's all laid out for you, and you can be creative within that. But for something like this, I was like, okay, so I've got this triangle thing, right? It's cool, it's emitting particles, there's stuff coming off, it looks really awesome, but what am I trying to do? What do I want to do? And the second part of that is like, okay, maybe it opens up, maybe there's something in there. And I was like, I haven't really shown the logo yet. And I knew I had to end the video with the logo itself. So I was like, okay, maybe the logo's wrapped in some kind of armor or some like sci-fi object that needs to open up and something cool needs to happen to it. And that's basically how I started getting at it. So I was like, okay, so maybe this stuff fades away first. And then, come on. And then, there we go. So you get closer to it, you see all these fade away, and even the way they fade away, it was that smooth trick that I showed earlier, but these are all triangles. I wanted to make sure that everything in there was a triangle somehow, and that was sort of part of it. And we move along. And then, okay, I want to have this line, I got to get rid of it somehow. So I was like, all right, it explodes into particles and sort of dies away and does some really cool stuff. And yeah. Then we get rid of that. I'm like, all right, cool. So now what I'm left with are these things. So I'm like, okay, it should open up. And I figured out that effect. And then after that, I was like, okay, I'm just going to drop these down as if something is left, and then just fade in or sort of bring in the titles. So to basically try and answer your question quickly, on this one, I improvised a lot. I just sort of let the project figure out for itself where it needed to go, and went from there. So it depends, but a lot of the time I'll sort of let it flow a little bit the way it should. So something else to note, when I do transitions, I tend to add in these little flickers and things. So let's see in the footage. So basically I use this one, which I just shot. I took the lens off my camera, and I think I had, I don't know what it was, just a light or something. I just wiggled it around until I got these really weird flickery things, and I'll just put them whenever I transition from shot to shot. I'll try to put something in just to make it look a little bit more interesting. Same with this one. This is just camera without its lens, and you can even do this with a smartphone if you wanted to, and a bottle of water. And I put a light on my desk that shined up. I held my camera in front of me, just had a bottle with some water in it, moved around in front of the camera, and that's what I got, and it looked really cool. And you can create these elements in like 5 minutes, and then when you overlay them, it makes your thing look really cool. So you just fade them in a little bit over the cut, and then you get this very dynamic looking effect. And that's another way of making your edit seem really nice and really natural, is to add in these organic elements that were filmed. It gives that extra layer of sort of, I don't know, coolness, I guess, if you want to call it that. It's simple. They're just simple tricks, but they work really well when you combine them all together. So for this last little bit, I'll actually show you what I mean by that iteration, which is something I wanted to talk about as well. So this is an earlier version of the project. There's going to be some names in different places and things, but whenever I'm doing this stuff, these were already rendered, these first two shots, because I was super into them. And there's some mistakes here with the placement of everything. But the cool part is that I tend to use my viewport previews and already start editing, because if you're going to iterate on things, you've got to make sure that the story sort of works. You're going to see there's a different shot in here that I didn't end up using because I didn't like the way this closed, and I really didn't like the way it looked. I just thought it looked terrible. And then this is the shot where the frame disappears around the thing, and it looked different as well. So I'm constantly trying things, and these, even though these for the most part are rendered, just go back and change them. Like don't be afraid to mess around with it. So this is what I had. This is sort of in the middle of the project as I'm editing. This is, I think, the day after, where some stuff had been rendered. I changed some stuff. I'm just going to move forward here. Here again. Come on, next one, next one. This is still the same. So I had that one fairly quickly. I like the idea of sort of revolving around that point. And then for this one, I finally figured out, okay, this is a better way to show it. And it was a nicer way to have the movement sort of start and figure it out. And this is another version of that same shot. And I still wasn't happy with this. And don't mind the names, they're in the wrong place. But I still wasn't happy with the way it looked. It didn't feel as good as the other ones. And I do that a lot. I just go back and try and make it feel more coherent in the edit as well. And you've got viewport previews, so just use them. Don't be afraid to, sorry, there's like a bug in here. Don't be afraid to try again. A viewport preview only takes a couple of minutes to check out or to render out, so just go for it, you know. Nothing's stopping you. And then you can see as this stuff all gets rendered further and further, and now I figured this one out. There's something wrong with the aspect ratio here, don't mind that, but I was like, okay, I like the way this looks, and there was some render errors in there that I needed to fix. And if you look closely, they're still in there a little bit. There's some motion blur artifacts, unfortunately. And I had more, and then I figured out, okay, so this is spinning now, and so to get it to make it look right, and that's it. And then just some basic particles here at the end to make it look cool. So I think this is one of the last ones before I was finished. I think most of the shots are rendered here. Yeah, there we go. And this was probably an earlier one where the names were still wrong, and then we arrived at the final one, which is really cool. So did I use HDRIs to light my scene? Yes, I think I used HDRIs almost exclusively. I use the Blender Cloud add-on, which allows me, I've got a Blender Cloud subscription, so if you use the add-on, if you hit Control-Shift-Alt-A in Blender, and I'll actually show you that really quickly because it's really cool. It's a little bit of a plug. Unfortunately, the Blender Cloud costs money. It's 10 euros a month, but I really like it because if I hit Control-Shift-Alt-A, what happens is I have their entire HDRI library of the Blender Cloud, and all I have to do is just click it, and it loads it into Blender, and I have to put it into an environment map, and that's it. It's super fast. It works really, really well, and my favorite ones, basically this courtyard one, I use it all the time because it's got really nice natural lighting. It's got sort of blue on one side, orange on the other. I really like that stuff. And I tend to use a lot of my favorite ones over and over and over again. Like this courtyard, this veranda, and these pillars have been used absolutely to death in a lot of my stuff. And then, which other ones? Oh yeah, this cave wall I use a lot as well. And I'll try some of the other ones, but yeah, I'll do stuff with HDRIs. I'll mix multiple HDRIs as well. You should definitely look into Gleb Alexandrov's lighting tips on YouTube. He explains some stuff on how he mixes HDRIs, and I use a lot of those tricks as well. They're really, really cool. And yeah, it's not just HDRIs, but it's also textures, and even my landscape textures are in there as well if people want to use them. So the cool thing about all of the stuff that's in here as well is it's public domain, so you can use it for anything. You can even redistribute it with your files and everything. It's super cool. I think it's great. Every now and again a few get added to it, but yeah, with the ones that are in there, I almost light everything in Blender. I'll put in extra lights here and there if I feel I need to highlight something, but for the most part I'll be using HDRIs. And yeah, and I think that's pretty much it for me. So if there's any people with questions, I'd be happy to answer some. I don't know, yeah, I don't know what the lag is like, so I might have to give it a minute. But that pretty much covers it. So yeah, this project, I think I spent about two-ish weeks on it. And that's on and off with rendering and doing other stuff in between. I don't know, I had a good time. What about inspiration? Any recommendations? Instagram. There's a lot of really great Instagram groups. Try to figure some people out that you like. I'm a big fan of guys like Ash Thorpe, Danny Yunt, G-Monk. Actually, I'll put in some names here. So Ash Thorpe is one, G-Monk is another, Danny Yunt, and yeah, once you get to some other stuff, I think there's, I'm trying to figure out, on Instagram you've got Empire of Future, and at Motion Designers, and those are only a couple of people. Once you start looking into those, you'll find way more people as well. The JS placement application that I talked about as well, there's a lot of people using that. If you follow that sort of rabbit hole of people using it on their website, or on the guy's website, it's one guy that develops it as far as I know. There's a lot of really cool people there, but definitely a lot of Instagram. I really like Instagram because it's just the image and no bullshit, to be honest. And yeah, just go from there. I mean, just find what works for you. I watch a lot of movies as well. Even when I'm working, I'll generally have a movie on, just because I'm always looking at sort of the grain and the way camera lenses behave and the way directors and cinematographers are framing things and just trying to tell a story visually. I guess I'm a little bit obsessed with that kind of stuff. But yeah, it's cool because this is the first project. Actually, there's one last thing as well, but unfortunately I can't open it. But this is the first project for me where I did literally everything. So even the music I did myself. Unfortunately, I had to reformat my computer recently for something, and I haven't reinstalled my music software yet. So I use Bitwig Studio for making music, but I did everything myself, and that's like one of the very first times for me that on a project like this I've been able to do everything from start to finish, and that is a really cool feeling. I'm not the best electronic musician, I'll immediately admit to that, but nowadays if you're gonna put stuff online, it's really, really annoying if you have to use copyrighted music, and it's just a pain in the butt when you get copyright strikes and things like that. So yeah, I don't know if there's any more questions. Oh yeah, motionographer.com, that got mentioned in the comments, is a really good one as well. There's some really cool stuff on there. And once you get to know some of those artists, you'll automatically be led to other stuff. The first guy I mentioned, Ash Thorpe, he runs the Collective podcast, and they also have him and somebody else, they run something called Learn Squared. They do live streams as well, and it's all these people like in the movie industry, all these really crazy high-end artists showing stuff. It's really, really interesting. I highly recommend it. So yeah, I think that about covers it. We didn't get a lot of questions at the end, so I think hopefully I was complete enough for most people. And we've been going for over an hour, so it's been a while. Okay, well, when am I starting my Learn Squared course? I don't know. The moment they figure out who I am, I guess. But yeah, I would love to, but I don't know if I'm at their level yet. I doubt it. I think I need to get a little bit better before I start hitting them up for stuff. But I'd be happy to do one if they're listening. All right, so any great place to look up super advanced tricks and tutorials? FX PhD courses are really, really good, but they're very, very expensive. But they're really high-end stuff. Just look all over the place. I would even say, even if you're pretty good at Blender already, I also recommend that you look at a lot of beginner tutorials. And the reason for that is everybody's got sort of a different idea of what people sort of need. Somebody said yeah here, thank you. But yeah, so what I was saying is everybody's got a different idea of what people need to know as a beginner, and there's a lot of great sort of little tricks here and there, and you can put all those together, and usually it's a lot more about putting all those little things together and getting better at adding details and creating more complex images and more complex animations than really I guess really looking for like that one big trick that will put everything. So yeah, so somebody's saying you've learned a lot from children. No shame, exactly. I honestly think it's great. Like if I can learn something from somebody that's like, I don't know, 12 or 13 years old, that's like better at a part of Blender than I am, that's really cool. At the end of the day, for me, that's what it's all about, and that's why I do this stuff as well. And it's just really important that you keep an open mind, and there's nothing wrong with if you see stuff that you really like and you think is really cool, or if you see some of the effects in this video as well, just try them out for yourself. Now you know how to do it. Just see how you fare, and you might figure out an extra sort of layer on top of that that makes it look even cooler or makes it more unique, or you know, you can do something else with it. I don't mind, you know, just go nuts and have fun with it. Really, that's it. Yeah, I hope that sort of answered your question. But okay, I think I'm gonna leave it at this. We're approaching an hour and 15 minutes, so I had a really nice time. I hope you guys thought it was interesting, and especially for the people watching in the future, watching the archive, I hope it was interesting. So, all right, thanks again, guys, and have a really nice night or morning or evening or whatever you are. I'm gonna enjoy the rest of my night and probably watch a movie. So, all right, see you later.